Like the office they commemorate, presidential libraries are living institutions. Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future.
Welcome to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute's virtual event series. To fulfill President Reagan's mission of making the Reagan Library a dynamic intellectual forum, our Center for Public Affairs programming offers lectures and forums presenting perspectives on important public policy issues of the day. Each year, we bring you 20 to 30 events from politicians, authors, members of the media, business and military leaders, and more. Since the March 2020 closure of many businesses across our great country, the Reagan Foundation is now bringing its events online to ensure that we are still delivering world-class content, even if you can't get to our hilltop to watch it in person. In this week's Center for Public Affairs virtual event, we invite you to join us for a conversation with former GE CEO Jeff Immelt for a conversation on his latest book, Hot Seat: What I Learned Leading a Great American Company. Jeff Immelt served as chairman and CEO of GE for 16 years, where he revamped the company's strategy, global footprint, workforce, and culture. During his tenure, he led several innovative transformations that doubled industrial earnings, reshaped the portfolio, re-established market leadership, and quadrupled emerging market revenue. He has been named one of the world's best CEOs 3 times by Barron's. He is currently a venture partner at New Enterprise Associates. When asked in February of 2021 why he wrote Hot Seat, Jeff Immelt said, "I've had almost 4 years to kind of sit and watch the way the company's been covered. And I felt like the GE team deserved a more complete history of what we all did together." He continued, "And particularly in the pandemic, all leadership is crisis leadership. So I feel like over the twists and turns of my experience, there are things I learned that others can benefit from as well." We now invite you to enjoy our virtual program, coming to you from our Air Force One Pavilion Leadership Academy Oval Office with Jeff Immelt and Reagan Foundation Institute Executive Director John Hybush.
This is a moment in the Reagan Foundation's history that I've been personally waiting for, and I know a lot of others have as well. And that is to sit for a few minutes with Jeff Immelt, a remarkable guy with one heck of a book that is really worth a read, whether you're in the business community or not. And I just want to welcome you, Jeff, to the program at the Reagan Library, and thanks for all you've done for the library over the years and all your service to the country and everything else. It's been terrific to know you and to dive into a book like this, it's just a treasure. So thank you for writing it.
Thank you, John. Great to see you again.
You too. What have you been up to, Jeff, since departing GE 4 years ago? I know you know, maybe formally you might have retired, but there's no way Jeff Immelt really retires. So what's been going on in your life?
Yeah, John, no, so I lived all over the place in my GE career, but I had never lived in California, never been in Silicon Valley. I wanted, when I retired, to kind of work with startups, entrepreneurs. I convinced my wife to spend part of the year in California, which is where I am right now. So I basically do venture capital for healthcare in industrial companies, and I teach a class on systems leadership at Stanford Business School. And I do kind of private investing, John, really in the healthcare space. But I thought one of the ways I could give back was by helping founders, young entrepreneurs, business students, kind of tell them what I learned and hopefully give them, kind of the right advice as they build their companies and start their career.
Sure. I bet that must be a lot of fun, particularly the professor part and looking out amongst a class. Probably it's been virtually a lot this past year, but dealing directly with students who have probably just soaked this stuff up, right?
It's great, and this is the generation, John, that's lived through the financial crisis, COVID. I think you see the same thing with the GE Reagan scholars. This generation is being shaped by crisis as much as anything else. And, I've got hopes for what they're going to do in the world. So, yeah, no, it is super rewarding. And I really enjoy working with them.
Yeah, great to hear that. So, Jeff, I want to spin the clock way, way, way back and this is in your book, but this is, you're fresh out of college, Harvard, on a fast track. And you wrote that you had some great job offers for a fair amount of money at the time from, I think, BCG, Morgan Stanley. But you decided to get your start at GE for a lot less money. And you write that your father had been with the company for years and years. I wonder, was your father part of that decision? Was this, following my dad's footsteps? Was he really proud of you? Or no, there's a very different story to that.
John, I had a great middle-class upbringing in Cincinnati, Ohio. My dad was super proud to work for GE. He worked in the aircraft engines business. That was kind of, I grew up around. Now, when I went to work, what I really thought I did is I wanted to be an operator, not an investor. I wanted to be a manager, not a consultant. I wanted to go, I kind of thought about it like, I'll go to work for GE, I'll learn as much as I can, I'll stay 5 years and then raise my head and see what I'll do next. And those 5 years became 35 years by the time I retired. But the grounding was really quite good. Like I love the town I grew up in. I think I always knew the value of a GE job because I grew up around a kitchen table with somebody that kind of did that work. And I had that with me throughout my entire career. So it was a good framing for a career. But it wasn't why I just wanted to get a good training in what it felt like to be a manager. And that's really why I did what I did.
Sure. Now, you didn't write this in the book, but, so oftentimes you'll read famous CEOs, they'll make the claim, well, I knew from the moment I walked in that company, I was going to run it someday. It doesn't sound like that was the case with you.
No, look, I think people that really think about their life in that way are always going to be disappointed. I always wanted to learn a lot. I wanted to try my best. I wanted to work around really great people. I probably, when I was about 40 years old, I began to see that it might be a possibility. But I think careers are really built on performance and learning, but also luck. And so you can never really hang on any specific kind of, I'd say, item or activity or job, but you really just have to be flexible and learn and trust. And I always did those things. And I think the blessing I had, John, and probably the same for you, is that in good times and bad, that's largely how I felt about my times at the company.
I was just fascinated to see, Jeff, early in your career at GE, I think you're with the appliances division. But yet you're in meetings and at some points reporting directly to Jack Welch, and you go through what had to be just an incredibly difficult, terrible experience with what it looked like was an air conditioner compressor and a recall, and you had like $500 million loss. You got your way through it. You persevered. You didn't say this in the book, but I just wondered if your ability to master that situation, to get GE past it, was that like a very early sign to Jack Welch that, hey, this guy, Jeff Immelt, he's got potential. He maybe is maybe a CEO someday?
I think so. John, I say in the book, but I've said throughout my career, you never know anything about people in their best day. You can only judge them by how they act in their worst days. And this happened when I was in my early 30s. I worked in the appliance business, and I was the service leader when we had to repair 3 million compressors. And when you're in the middle of a storm like this, it ends you end up in the chairman's office like once a month for 18 months. And I would tell my wife, look, I've got to get my resume ready because I'm going to get fired. I know that for a fact. My days are numbered. And they were tough, really tough sessions. But, look, I knew my business. John, both me and the people that I worked with, we all learned how to fix compressors. And we would go out like one day every other week, and we would go with the service techs, and we would sit on the floor of somebody's kitchen and things like that. And more than once, when I was in the boardroom, getting the heck beat out of me, I would push back because I actually knew how a compressor was fixed, right?
Sure.
And I knew what took time and what could be done and what couldn't be done. And so, I think those are the kinds of things that get you on the scoreboard, somewhere, particularly in a big company. And I learned a lot about the boss. Like I learned that, good leaders like Jack, they could be really tough, but they came out the right door in terms of putting consumers first and, fixing problems and things like that. So it was a good way to kind of learn what you do when things don't work. And a lot of times you're going to go through stretches like that. But this was early on, it kind of got me a sense for, hey, I could get through really tough. Those are valuable lessons. Yeah.
Yeah, got it. Okay, now I'm going to fast forward, and I promise I'm going to come back to other GE history in between. But you had to have had the biggest trial by fire of any brand new CEO on your second day on the job. Tell us about that. Now, this is second day on the job as the new CEO of GE.
Yeah, look, I had gone through a very public succession process, in a very public company. My first day on the job was September 10th, 2001. I do a kind of an all-employee broadcast on that day. I fly to Seattle that night, and I wake up the next morning, and I'm exercising, and I'm watching TV, and I saw the second plane hit the World Trade Center. And so here I am on the second day on the job, and you basically see the world change. And in our case, we had insurance on the buildings. We owned 1,200 aircraft. We owned NBC at that time, which went 4 or 5 days with no commercials. And we worried about our employees who are spread all around the world, and we worried about our country. And, it just gives you no honeymoon, John. Like you can't go and say, hey guys, I can't make that decision because I've only been on the job for a week.
Yeah.
Over the next month or 2 months, we're making decisions to loan billions to the airlines, going to Washington to argue for, kind of the Airline Relief Act. We were, trying to make sure harden the facilities that we had inside the company, deciding what would be the future of the commercial aviation business. Really, when you were sitting in September of 2001, you didn't know if people would ever get on a plane again and fly anywhere, right? So we were just going through the whole thing. But I think in a crisis, you learn to absorb fear, right? In a crisis, you learn that you have to kind of take things on, give the right kind of direction to the company, make the right decisions, but you can't be sometimes in a crisis, people magnify fear and they use it for their own purposes. I think good leaders in a crisis learn how to absorb it and show people how to take how do you take the certain steps, even when you don't know the answer, they're going to put you in the right direction and not blame people, not worry too much, just get on and get on with leading, right? So I think that's what you learn about leadership in a crisis.
Yeah, well said. Okay, now I know, I don't think certainly when you were at General Electric or right after you left, you thought, I'm going to write the classic business book. Here's my leadership model, here's how. Rather, you stayed quiet, stayed silent, got on with your life. And then I think this is accurate. You pick up Fortune, and there's this article by Jeff Colvin, and you said, now, wait a minute. It's my time to speak now. Is that pretty much how it happened?
I'd say, John, I needed time to think. Clearly, my career at GE didn't end the way I wanted it to. I needed to kind of think, and we moved to California. I had a chance to kind of reflect on things I would have done differently and what I learned and things like that. But I also know that truth equals facts plus context. And all the context have gone missing around the company. And it's not just me, there's hundreds of thousands of people I worked with who did a lot more good things than bad things. And I just was really unhappy that nobody was telling their story. And what I decided to do, John, was not rush into anything, but to hire a co-author who was a great woman journalist from the LA Times, and had her interview 75 people, both inside and outside the company, and really write a complete, reflective, I'd say truth, even when sometimes it hurt, right? Even when sometimes it hurt to tell the story, I made sure that the story got told, really because I wanted to have context. The other piece is, I work with students today, like you and I were discussing earlier, and I know that they don't want to hear, here are the 7 reasons I'm perfect, right? Like most business books really stink, right?
Yeah.
And so, I think in this era that we live in, all leadership is crisis leadership. And there's a lot that I went through that hopefully people can read the book and learn from. And I think, look, John, I think you've lived around the political side. I think when you're thoughtful, when you've been reflective, when you've been humbled, you earn the right to defend yourself. And so I tried to tell the story without being defensive, but by being truthful, abundantly truthful. And that's what I try to do.
Yeah, well, the book comes off that way, I have to tell you. Let's get into a section, parts of the book where I'll say Jack Welch, the famed CEO, your boss for many years. Jeff, either in reading in black or white or reading between the lines, oftentimes I felt like the story you were trying to tell about Jack Welch he was sometimes protagonist, maybe sometimes, these are my words, not yours, villain in this novel, in the sense that the world had an impression of Jack Welch, the great leader that he was, which had been built up over many years. But not a lot of people, except guys like you, had the ability and the insight to be working right there next to him, to see the decisions that were made over the years, to really understand what kind of leader he was. And so I want to just ask you a few questions about him, about your relationship with him, that you touch on in the book, and just give it your best at it. And the first I wanted to, let's give this story context. Tell the story about it was determined you were going to be the CEO, but it was not yet, you had not yet taken over. And you go to play golf with some friends outside Chicago, because this is just it's a classic setup for your relationship in the company vis-a-vis Jack and all the rest.
So, I think the impression I'd like to give, John, is that Jack was a really great leader, a really great CEO, but the world just changed so dramatically. And by the end of the 90s, we were in a situation where perception didn't equal reality. So we had a company that was half financial, half industrial, and we traded like Amazon or Apple or something like that. And, that was bound to change. It was bound to end poorly. So I was just about ready to become, CEO, and Jack was going to retire. I'm playing golf with friends. I'm in Chicago. I'm in the locker room. Somebody says, "Hey, hi, how are you? You're new here." I said, "Yeah, I'm a guest." He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I work for GE." And he says, GE, Jack Welch. I feel sorry for the poor son of a bitch that's taking his spot. So I put my shoes on, go out, we go to the first tee, and we just laughed for 4 hours about that. But, it was just, John, it was the era that we lived in, that air was going to come out of, some of these companies, and it was just, our reality was different than, how we were viewed. But again, in the 80s and 90s, really, Jack was a great leader, was a great CEO, but the world was just really completely different post 9/11, post Enron, and all those things, and we needed to take the company forward.
Yeah, sure. And I will get into that a little more in a minute, but I'm just curious. This is a personal curiosity thing. You told a story in the book about how you were selected to be the CEO, and then you got the call. I mean, this was after this beauty contest that took place. How did you feel when you got that call, Jeff? I mean,
It's a great question. In some ways, it was relief. John, not so much that I got the job, but because the last year was so public and was so exhausting for me and my family, whether, kind of like get the job or not get the job, I was relieved that it was over, that there was some certainty and next step, as was my family, so that was what, and then, I think, anybody that takes a job like that and isn't somewhat intimidated and somewhat insecure, they're lying to you. So I had all the other emotions about, okay, what the heck? What the heck? Now that I got, what the heck do you do now? And I had all those emotions as well, for sure.
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you, in reading about the succession process and how Jack set it up and the competition between you and Nardelli and Jim McInerney, great leaders themselves. That is exactly not how I would run a succession process in a major operation. It just seems to, but yet that's what GE did. Now, is that common in the corporate experience?
I don't think so. I don't think so. Right. In other words, it was unique to the time. It was unique to us. I don't think people since then have followed it. Now, the succession process is part of, think about it in political terms. How a candidate runs the campaign gives you some sense for how they're going to govern, right? It's not completely, determinative, but, so how you conduct yourself when you're under a magnifying glass it gives people data points in terms of how you're going to conduct yourself when you're really under a magnifying glass. But at the same time, look, you never want to lose good people. Losing leaders like Jim and Bob and other people that left with him, that's hard, right, for any company. So I think to a certain extent, you want to think about how do you maintain the largest group of leaders, not how many you push out artificially. And I think that's why very few people have actually copied that as you look forward in the subsequent years.
Sure, yeah. I mean, of all the dynamics of that process, the one that would concern me most inside the company is why are we pushing some of our best talent out the door? It just
Jack told me, look, if you don't get the job, you have to leave, right? He said that to all three of us. And I said to him, John, I said, you're kidding. You're kidding me, right? Aren't you? He said, no, that's what we wanted and stuff like that. Because I would have stayed. I like the company, I like the people, but it is what it is. And
yeah, sure.
Yeah,
it was his approach. Yeah, and you referred to this just a minute ago, Jeff, and I just explored a little bit further, but I get the sense, you talked about the perception reality difference with the company, and there's Jack, the manager of the century, so-called, and it feels like the 50 PE, the 60 PE, whatever, that a great deal of that was just purely built off of the personality and reputation of Jack Welch. It didn't have to do with a lot of business fundamentals, right?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it was kind of the era of the celebrity CEO, a little bit of the .com era built in there. After 9/11 happened, the markets were closed for a week and the market reopened. And the first day the market reopened, our largest investors sold half their stake. Yeah. And I called them that day and said, what are you doing? You're scaring people. Really, the company's okay. And they said, we didn't realize that GE was so big in the insurance business. And I said, well, you own $4 billion of stock. How did you not know, this is one of our biggest businesses. So I just think, you need to be transparent. You're always wrestling with getting perception and reality in sync, and that was a challenge. Certainly, when I first became CEO, that was a challenge.
Sure. Now, another of the practices that I think Jack had it introduced in GE during his time, the whole Six Sigma process that you talk about, and people running around wanting to be black belts and measuring every metric to the nth degree, and that whole important and successful practice, I think. It seemed to work wonders at GE. I remember we, in a Fortune 500 company I worked at, we sometimes hired guys from GE. They were just master leaders. It's a terrific process, but I also think you might have felt that there was a perseveration on that management style at GE such that innovation would often take a back seat. What's something that GE was known for years, because everyone's so preoccupied with measuring metrics. Is that a fair way to say it?
Yeah, look, I talk about it in the book. I think that the company had leaned heavily into management processes, which are great, by the way, in and of themselves. But there's a difference between a management process and an innovative idea, and companies need both. And I think we all felt like we had leaned too heavily into the management process side and not enough in the innovation and idea side. And so heavily, that was kind of where we started to reinvest in the early 2000s into life sciences and renewable energy and in industries like that. And if you think, really, John, if you look at the last 20 years, if you look at the companies that have really done, very well, it's Amazon and Apple and Tesla. And these are companies where really the product, the technology, the innovation takes front and center. They're well run, they have good processes, but the ideas rule. And that was kind of the change subtly I wanted to make in the company, because Six Sigma is great as far as it goes, but it's not an innovation. It's not a new business. It's not an idea that's going to help you grow. It's going to help you manage better, and you need both. But we had leaned too heavily one versus the other, and
yeah,
that was
sure.
the change we wanted to make.
Yeah. Now, it feels to me, Jeff, in reading what you wrote, that probably the biggest I wish I had done it differently situation was you stepped in, stared at the balance sheet. I'm sure you knew this beforehand, but going in, here's 40% of the company's profits is in a bank, essentially, not a real bank, but the whole finance business. And you looked at it and said, now that's not right. We're going to need to change the mix if we want to be more innovative. But at the same time, it was the most profitable element of the company. So you're saying to yourself, how do I get us out of a successful mix here and drive towards a lot of change? And that seems to have been almost a near impossible call.
Yeah, clearly, when I look back, and I say this in the book, we dramatically invested in industrial technology and innovation, but we decided to also grow financial services at the same time. So even while we had improved dramatically the industrial company, it was still 50-50 financial and GE Capital. And that was working until Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, right? And when we go into the financial crisis, we had a big financial business that was what's called a finance company. So we didn't really take deposits per se. We used kind of unsecured debt, and we were a AAA rated company. So that was a logical approach. But that was exactly the wrong business model to have, during the financial crisis, because banks got protected. So deposits got protected while the debt markets really got, kind of, I'd say, blown up and then reconstructed. And so our business model really suffered as we went through that. And look, I had the chance, John, probably early in my tenure to take a more profound look and more dramatically change the mix. And I didn't do that. And I own that in the book, right? That, like I said, it worked until it didn't. And that really set the company back. And I talk about that, as you said in the book, very, very openly about all that.
Yeah, sure. And look, you're the any CEO I've ever known about. You're willing to step forward and take responsibility for mistakes you made, decisions you made. But I have to tell you, having again been a peon in another Fortune 500 company, 999 out of 1,000 CEOs would have made the same decision you did. I'm sure of that. So this is my analogy, not yours, but when I read your description of the company's reliance on the finance business as it floated along was, the finance business to GE, it was like heroin, it was like a super high that was eventually the company needed to get off if it wanted to become innovative, but it was just damn difficult, right?
We had great businesses and a great team, but what happens, I think, John, is you don't realize when you become too big, right? And I think where we should have capped the size at some point, because again, even good businesses, when they get too big, it's really difficult to go through, the kind of turbulent markets like we went through during the financial crisis.
I don't know if I'm artful enough to ask the question the right way here, Jeff, but so you can give me a better answer than the question you're going to be asked. This is one of my last questions about Jack Welch as CEO. You're in the book, let me quote from you, said, at this point in time, I finally realized that he, meaning former CEO Jack Welch, was using his criticisms of me to promote his own brand. And when I read that, I said to myself, I'm sure Jack Welch, there wasn't a day in his life when he did not want GE to succeed. However, in some respect, your failures at any given time helped to burnish his brand. I mean, it's just this incredibly ironic situation where there's the brand of Jack Welch and the brand of GE, and when it came down to it, after he had left the company, his brand was more important than GE.
Again, I go back, John, and say he was a really good CEO. I learned a ton from him. He was amazing in his time. The times changed. There were a few moments when I could have really used his help and in public, and he chose not to help in those times. But even to the day I retired, when I had a really tough decision, I would call him. John, it's crazy. like even after those times when I really was resented it, I needed somebody that I really felt could give me good insight. I would call him, and he would talk to me. And so we never lost connection. I never lost great affection for him. I was really sad when he died, but there were probably 2 or 3 moments where his hand on mine in a really tough moment would have really mattered, and that just didn't happen, right? So
yeah,
again, my mistakes are my own, right? But it goes to friendships of any kind, John. Like, all of us are blessed to have friends, but there are moments in your life when you really need a friend. When you really need a friend, and you always know who was there at that moment and who wasn't there at that moment, and that defines relationships for a long time.
Yeah, sure. Now, I want to refer to one of your star employees as you were CEO, Gary Sheffer, who ran corporate communications for GE for years. Incredible talent, and I know he would appreciate what I'm about to say, and that is, I think sometimes, Jeff, in your tenure as CEO, the business press reporters often didn't give you the benefit of the doubt when tough times came, because these are the very same guys who had a vested interest in the Jack Welch myth reality standing. In other words, they had built Jack up to be the titan of world industry for many years. And I frankly believe it'd be kind of difficult for them to lay any of the blame of GE's problems on him, because they had a vested interest in proving that they were right. And it's unfortunate, but that's my view. That's my take on it.
Look, John, I think it's, again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but this was a really great CEO on his own. But when he died, the business press, all the people that praised him when he was living, stabbed him in the back when he died. And I found that to be profoundly sad, right? And it just shows you, we live in a world without nuance, John, today. And I think, whether it's political media or business media, nobody wants to tell a complicated story. It's kind of white hat, black hat all the time. And in essence, business is more complicated, politics is more complicated, companies are more complicated. So you need great people like Gary as communicators to help break out when messaging is really, people want to simplify everything, and it's just not that simple.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'm done with my Jack Welch issues and questions, but let me, very tangentially, I'm thinking if someone put the question to you, Jeff, Jeff, if you had the choice of not taking that call from Jack Welch years ago, or if you weren't picked to be the #1 guy, your career at GE would have probably ended just like you wanted to, a smashing success and all those things. But yet I have to think that if we went back to that day, even knowing what you know today, you still would have made that decision to take the role. And
I completely agree, John. Running GE was a joy. It was a joy. It was an honor. I loved it even in the worst days. I wouldn't have picked the way it ended, but I love the people I worked with. I love the company. And so I always felt like, and really, like I said, and I think you get in the book, like the only thing I would have changed is me. I wish I was smarter sometimes or a different cycle sometimes, but I think it's, everybody likes to talk about how hard the CEO's jobs are and things like that. And don't get me wrong, they're hard, but it was joyful. And, having written the book, I probably heard from hundreds of GE employees, on LinkedIn or emails or things like that. And it's just great to hear from them again, because in the end, that's who you remember the most.
Yeah, sure. That's nice. Okay, I'm going to broaden it out for a minute and just talk more broadly about corporate dynamics and then get into the back half of your book because it's some wonderful stuff. Can you talk about corporate responsibility for a moment? Now, I remember having spoken to you years ago, and you were expanding business in South America, China, all over the world. And I'd asked you a question, and you said, "Hey, John, you got to go where the business is," And this was at a time when a lot of people were questioning, American companies sending jobs and manufacturing overseas. Talk to us for a minute just about corporate responsibility when it comes to succeeding and making a profit, but at the same time supporting your country.
Yeah, look, a complicated question, I think, particularly today. And there's no simple answer to it, because I think you have lots of constituencies that you have to respect. You have investors and customers and employees and communities that all are important. I would say kind of, you always have to compete. And at the end of the day, competitive companies don't succeed. So you need to always have in the spirit of everybody you work with that you want to win, that you want to compete, you want to be profitable, you want to generate cash, you want to do those things. But I think at the same time, sometimes CEOs stick their head in the sand about, you're part of the world, right? You've got to be connected to the world going on around you. And I'll just talk about it in one context. Early in my career, the 80s and 90s, basically people like me, we could put jobs wherever we wanted to and have no consequence, right? So we could say, look, we used to make refrigerators in Louisville, but now we can make them cheaper in Mexico. So we're going to shut down the factory in Louisville and we're going to move the factory to Mexico. Or we used to do backroom work in Cincinnati, now we're going to do it in India. And that was applauded, right? That was viewed as being an effective business leader, allocator of capital, things like that. That changed. It changed because of the financial crisis. It changed because of politics. It changed because of middle-class jobs. So, by the 2010 to 2020 time period, John, I was moving jobs back to the US because we could do them competitively, because we felt it was important to make things in the markets where we sold them, including the US. So it's just a long-winded answer of like, at the end of the day, companies have to compete and can't give up on that. But they lose when they don't understand that you're part of a bigger ecosystem, and that ecosystem changes. You know, nationalism was happening in the US long before President Trump got elected. He magnified it. He made it a cause, but it was happening long before that. And if people like me didn't see that or weren't reacting to it, we just weren't doing our job. Same way with diversity, right? Same way with environmental investing, right? Same way with governance. I just think those are things that have to be incorporated into your business model and not be treated as a check the box. Look, we're going to run the company, then we're going to do ESG as well, and not care about that. Those have to be completely aligned today, and that's what the best people are doing. The harder thing, I think, today, John, is that everything's political, and how do you navigate a company as big as GE or any company today without the appearance of taking sides, right, politically? And I think that just adds a layer of complexity on running a big institution today.
Yeah, you're right. And boy, and how times have changed, and the difficulty you just referred to, Jeff, because in the last couple of weeks, this situation where something like, 100 of the Fortune 500 have come out to slam the state of Georgia and move the All-Star game to Denver. And it's like the weight of social responsibility on corporations today just seems to be getting more and more magnified.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's just, and it's not going to stop, right? So you better, if you're running a company today, you better have your own methods in terms of how you're going to judge each one of these events and decide when to speak, when not to speak, and how to speak. Yeah.
Can you talk for a minute, Jeff, about the dynamic of change at a major corporation? And by that, I mean, I don't know if you use these words exactly, but the message I read from you in your book was, if you think change is tough when times are difficult, just try to make change when times are going well. Explain that.
So, I mean, I think, the world is, we live in this incredibly volatile world of technical disruption and rise of China and governance and all those things. So change is a constant, and anytime you have something big, change is even more difficult to execute. And a couple, we had changes that worked. I would say we were able to globalize the company really effectively. That really worked. We had changes that were more difficult to work, like trying to really invest substantially in digital technologies. That was a more difficult one. So, it's kind of like, it's staying focused, it's communicating, it's get your leaders on board, it's measuring results, it's knocking down barriers, but there's always antibodies in every organization that are going to try to drive you back. One of the things I go through with my students, John, is kind of like listening. Like when you're a student, they think that everything would just be great if you just listen to everybody all the time. You just listen to everybody all the time. And I try to go through with them. Look, I got in trouble in my career listening. I got in trouble in my career not listening. I was successful listening. I was successful not listening. And, you and I we intersected in our lives around Ronald Reagan, right? And, I think one of the things I admired in him so much is that he just had core beliefs, right? And I'm sure he had people like say, okay, back down on the Berlin Wall. It's not going to happen. He said, hey, sorry, guys. I want to say Gorbachev, tear down that wall, right? Yeah. How many people were advising him, don't use those words. You're going to really piss them off, Yeah. And so you need core beliefs. If you're going to drive change, you need core beliefs. And that drives persistence and repetition and taking flack when it comes. And I think that's, the bigger the institution, the more those core beliefs have to be really entrenched in what you're doing, right? So that's size can be a great advantage. Size can be a horrible disadvantage.
Yeah, yeah, understood. In a minute, I want to get into a quality that I think you and President Reagan very much shared, but that'll be just a minute. First, I just have a couple of questions about China, because we referenced China. What is your take, Jeff, with the complexity of the world today and the competition as it is? China seems to be making remarkable strides. It's got its sights set on world domination in many ways. The majority of the American people, though, now see China as literally as the enemy. Do you think there's more upside than democracies thought with respect to planned economies and the way China runs things? Or
it's a great question. I think most Americans are 5 or 10 years behind their thinking in China, is what I've found, or what I've always found. There's a whole military aspect, John, that I'm not as qualified to speak on as maybe other guests you could have. But from an economic standpoint, China is really becoming our peer. They've graduated more engineers than the US and Europe combined for 25 years. They're really doubling down on all the next generation digital technologies. They're going to do electric vehicles. They're going to do clean tech. They're going to do artificial intelligence. In addition, they're everywhere, right? So if you're checking into a hotel in Sao Paulo, the Chinese are there. If you're building a power plant in the Middle East, the Chinese are there. So their economic diplomacy is kind of what the US used to be, probably 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. So the notion that they're going to go away economically is just not going to happen, right? And so I think the challenge of the government, our government, is how do we do a good job of getting on the right footing from a national security and cyber standpoint, while recognizing that they're going to be an economic competitor, they're going to be an economic partner, hopefully, and they're going to be a big factor, in the future of the world. And they're just not going to go away from that. They're just not going to. So that's the challenge. Yeah, it is.
It seems a frightening challenge if we don't get it right.
We need relationships. John, kind of what I worry about is there's just no kind of there's no deep relationships that we have, I would say, in the State Department or Commerce Department anymore, where we actually 2 or 3 layers down, we actually know each other. And I could see from even 2000 to 2017, the erosion, not so much of interest, but the erosion just in the ability of, not just in China, but the ability of the U.S. government to actually be a meaningful, kind of be able to influence in a meaningful way events as they're taking place around the world.
Yeah, concerning. We talked. You met. You know President Xi. What's he like?
Yeah, look, they're very different in nature, right? I think the difference that Xi has in his predecessors is he really has complete, kind of control over the power base in China. And always, in the times, whether it's Hu or Jiang Zemin or other leaders that I had seen, there was always a piece that they didn't quite control, whether it was the military or state governments or things like that. Xi, over the course of his tenure, really is, kind of like one-man control, very centralized, very tight, and I think he never really has been the one that's been the public face to foreign investors and things like that. But I think he's worldly, but he's incredibly powerful and determined, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Putin, same thing.
Oh gosh, I'm old enough. I remember speaking with President Bush, kind of in the early 2000s, and I happened to be at an event at the White House, and I told him we're working on a couple projects in Russia, and back in those days, Putin was known as a reformer. right? And the kind of traversed from that to whatever you would call him today, which was a dictator or whatever. But it's the interesting thing in Russia is that, and a lot of these countries, is that the people in the country seem to at least accept, if not adopt, that kind of government being what they want, right? So you basically, not that I did a ton of stuff in Russia, but you basically saw that there was a reasonable sense that this was okay with the people in the communities in terms of the way they let, kind of one person rule for 20 years, right?
Sure,
and
sure.
I think, the advantage of being a big company globally, John, is that you could say no a lot. They respected you because they knew the size and the brand, and you were on the ground, right? So I could see all these countries from the inside out, not from the outside in. Even if you're an industrial company, you've got assets on the ground. If you're a tech company, if you're Microsoft or things like that, it's harder to see these countries from the inside out because it's a platform, it's over the top. But in our case, we had employees on the ground, so we got a chance to see it not just through the government's eyes, but through our own people's eyes, and ask them what was going on and how to think about it, how to stay clean, how to stay, how to make sure that we weren't ever coming anywhere close to things that would be against the interest of our own country or their country. And then, I would frequently call either, Secretary Clinton or Secretary Kerry or the Secretary of State to say, look, I'm going to the Middle East. Is there anything that I should be thinking about or doing or things like that? So I always try to keep close communication. But we were insiders, and that was good. That was a good place to be because we had people there and we had investment there. That made us able to make better judgments, I think.
Yeah, sure. And the people that you had there, it's not like you just had these rafts of American executives who worked over there. I saw it in real life. I mean, you had them's was you. I mean, you had some of their best and brightest people working for GE.
The woman that ran China for us, John, grew up in China. She went to school at Wisconsin. She worked around the world for GE, and then she went back to run our business in China. That's the kind of background. You can't buy that. You've got to create it over decades, and we had people like that in every corner of the world.
Sure,
and that's
a lot
what
of value.
Yeah.
Yeah. Last one of those personalities, and I was interested to see this. You were really impressed with Angela Merkel.
Yeah, so I knew Chancellor Merkel before she became chancellor. We did a lot of business in Germany. She was always willing to see, certainly me, but other kind of Western CEOs. I think she was a great combination of politician, but could get things done, right? And in the case of, Europe's got 1,000 problems, but in the case of being, when you're a chancellor of Germany, at least in her case, you also, you carry the biggest burden of the European Union. So, I watched her balance not just national interests, but also trying to be European, and frequently those came into conflict. And I just admired her ability to juggle so many balls at the same time, and do it as do it with the responsibility, but also I think she had in her heart real values that she held dear. Some of which got her in trouble sometimes.
Yeah. So let me go to the last 10 pages of the book, your last chapter. First, just to comment, I have to say, Jeff, they're probably, seeing these words from a CEO are some of the most refreshing that, like you say, I mean, there's so many books on the shelf with these leadership models, but your last 10 pages, they ought to be part of every MBA program in the nation. It required reading, I think, because you so very much simplify and focus in on, the what it takes part. It was just a great read. I want to say that. The 2008 financial crisis. What was your most important lesson learned?
always have one other plan. In other words, the importance of being able to pivot. What makes the financial crisis so hard was nobody knew what was going on. And just when you thought you were safe, another wave would capsize your boat. And I think the notion of like, we're never done. We did this today. We need to have 3 more ideas for this scenario tomorrow. And in some ways, John, it was my best leadership. It was our leadership team at its best. It was the finest teamwork I've ever seen between the board and the management team. Yet we were being criticized every day. So sometimes your best leadership is when the rain is on your head every day. And that was what the financial crisis was like.
Yeah. Talk about the concept of luck, because I think your point you said in your last chapter, luck really matters. Now, most CEOs don't want to admit that, but it's a fact, right?
Look, if you think about COVID, right? So if you go back to March of 2020, let's pick Delta Airline. Delta Airline is a very well-run airline, right? And COVID hits, and all of a sudden you have to lay off people. Your stock price goes down by 70%. You've done nothing wrong. Zoom, which we're on right now, the Zoom stock price goes up by 6-fold.
Yeah.
At one point, Zoom is worth more than every airline combined. Okay. Now,
yeah.
Sorry guys, that's luck. Okay, that's not skill. So it's not that I felt like I was burdened by bad luck or things like that. It's important for all of us because it dictates how we treat people, right? If you know that the world cycles, you treat people with respect every day because someday it's your turn, right?
Yeah.
But if you think that you're brilliant all the time, you leave people in your wake and they won't be there to help you when the world turns, because it will, right? So I think it's important to know that, because I think it dictates that you basically treat people with respect. You do that all the time, and that's what's really important.
Yeah, and I think for everything you just said, Jeff, with respect to business, you could insert the word politics there too. Same thing.
Totally, yeah, really. I mean, it's just the life cycles, John, and now it cycles really quickly.
Yeah. Last 2 questions. Optimism. I watched you as a leader, Jeff. You're an optimistic guy, even during tough times. And you said to your readers, it's really important for leaders, good times or bad, to be optimistic. That's the quality I think you really shared with Ronald Reagan, same way.
Yeah, look, it's not, there's a difference between being an optimist and sticking your head in the sand. And I think sometimes people get confused between, only pessimists have the right view of the world and things like that. But I think if you show people aspiration, even in the hardest day, if you say, yeah, it's hard now, but this is kind of where we're going, I think that's leadership, and I think it's particularly important now. I used to tell the story, John, about the association with Reagan. So I got out of business school in 1982. I voted for President Reagan in 1980. I graduated with $50,000 in debt. Interest rates were 15%. Unemployment was like 12%. And I said to myself, this guy has to work. We need this president. We need this president to work. And I just, as a young man, I had so much admiration for his ability to kind of lead the country through tough times. And then, when I had a chance to study him through the association with the library and things like that, it's just this incredible sense of purpose, right? And I've seen that in all great people I've known, like Warren Buffett, investor, Democrat, right? But he knows what he knows, right? He knows what he knows. He's true to what he knows all the time. And I think President Reagan was the same way. He was true to what he knew and what he felt all the time. He didn't follow fads. He was never afraid to kind of speak out in a certain way. And I think that's what most great people have in common. They know what they know.
Yeah, sure. Okay, one quality that you didn't, I think, mention, at least in the last chapter, was courage. But I'm going to raise it because, in my mind, Another quality that you just hit in spades was own your mistakes. And in my view, it takes a lot of courage for a CEO to do that. And that seemed to me to be a central thread throughout your book. And in the very end, you made the point, come what may, try your best. But at the end of the day, you got to own your mistakes because it'll make you a better person. And I think that's what this book is about and what you're about, Jeff.
Yeah, no, I think, John, I tried to title each chapter with a different leadership idea, and owning your mistakes is one of them. And I think to a certain extent, you have to realize if you're a leader that it's not about you, that there's thousands of people that work with you, or hundreds of people, or 10 or a dozen or however many. And in some ways, your ability to own mistakes, you do it on their behalf, right? So they're not judged poorly at the same time. And I think that's really critical, is the understanding that we all went through it together. And if we just allow things to be said that aren't true, or if we defend ourselves in the wrong way, it doesn't do anybody any good.
Yeah. Boy, what an hour well spent. We're right at the hour, Jeff. And I on behalf of the Reagan Foundation Board, all of us here, I just want to say thank you for such a great book. It's going to last in people's minds for a long, long time. I'm sure of that. And we just really appreciate all you've done for the Reagan Foundation, Reagan Library, the cause, and we wish you the very best of luck in the future.
Thank you, John. I'm so proud of my company's association with President Reagan and with my own personal association with you. I'm very proud of that. And I want to say thanks and wish all of you the best to get the library reopened again, and hopefully get back to some form of normal soon.
You bet. Thanks so much, Jeff.
Thanks, John. Good to be with you.
You too.
Thank you for joining us for today's virtual programming event. We hope this conversation has inspired you to share what you've learned with your family and friends, and that you'll join us again for an upcoming event.
And let me offer lesson number 1 about America. All great change in America begins at the dinner table. So tomorrow night in the kitchen, I hope the talking begins. And children, if your parents haven't been teaching you what it means to be an American, let them know and nail them on it. That would be a very American thing to do.